one of those things that there's a great saying of, I asked for things to be easier, but what I needed to be was stronger, right? Like, you don't actually want things easier. You want to be stronger. You want to be able to carry more, heavier, longer. That's the way to grow as an individual, as a leader, as a business owner.
You're listening to the Elevate podcast, and I'm your host, Robert Glazer. Join me as I talk to world-class performers about how they build their capacity and reach greater heights in leadership, business, and life, and how you can do the same. Welcome to the Elevate podcast. Our quote from today is from Theodore Levitt: "Creativity is thinking up new things. Innovation is doing new things." Today, I'm really excited to welcome back David Heinemeier Hansson, better known as DHH, to the Elevate podcast. He's the co-founder of Basecamp, which has been used by over 20 million people globally, and the founder of Hey, and the creator of the transformational Ruby on Rails, an open source web framework that was used to create Basecamp, Github, Shopify, Airbnb, and more. He's also a frequent writer at Hey World, the New York Times, best-selling author of 4 books, including Rework, and even an award-winning racecar driver. David, welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me again.
So I got to start off with we talked about a year ago, and it was great. And what I appreciate about you and Jason is you change your mind a lot and are willing to change your mind. But what is going on with Basecamp 37 Signals, Basecamp 30? Every time I write an article, someone tells me I have it wrong. Changing the company name.
So it's funny. So 37 Signals has been around since 1999.
Yeah.
And until, 2012 or 2014, we were 37 Signals. And after the company transitioned from being a consulting company that was doing design work to becoming a software company, which is really what we're known for today, as you mentioned, Basecamp with project management and Hey with email. We had a phase where we were very prolific, and we launched a bunch of different software tools, not only Basecamp, but also basically Slack 10 years before Slack in the form of something called Campfire. We launched a Highrise, a CRM tool that's still used to this day by people, even though we haven't sold it for a while. And then we realized in the early 2010s that doing all of that stuff with a team of less than 40 people was a little crazy even by our standards, and it wasn't sustainable. So our choices were, hey, here are 4, 5 products. They're all doing well in various regards, but one of them is doing substantially better than the others. Basecamp was on a rocket journey of its own, and we could either grow the company a ton at that moment to really do all these products justice at the same time, or we could do the very weird, very odd thing to say, you know what, we like it at 40 people. Let's get rid of some successful products. Let's stop selling those successful products and just focus on Basecamp. And that's what we did. So we changed our name to Basecamp. And then after having done that for about 6 or 7 years, you get that trigger, itchy finger that suddenly you have some of that creativity and you have some of that inspiration and you want to see it go somewhere. And we had too much of it for Basecamp to absorb all of it. So that's when we started working on Hey, the email service that had the crazy nonsense mission of taking on Gmail, literally one of the most successful software products in human history that is offered for free. And we went like, do you know what? I think we can do it better. And we can charge for it. So we did that. And it was a crazy launch. We signed up 30,000 people in 3 weeks, in part because Apple tried to kill us, and that gave us quite the spotlight. But finally, we realized, you know what? We're doing multiple products, and since then, we've launched a variety of other products. We've launched something called Once, where you get a web product you only pay for one time. I think there's a lot of people really tired of subscription overload, and we realized there's an opening in the market. We can do something here, and we're working on 2 new products at the same time. All of a sudden, we couldn't be called Basecamp anymore. Okay. So we thought, you know what? We're going to go back to 37 Signals. This was the origin of the company. We're now working and selling multiple products. This feels just right.
So you refuse. You retain the right to change your mind, but we're back to 37 Signals.
Yes, and I think this is. I mean, there is a broader point here, which is when new information or the circumstances change, you should change with it. I mean, otherwise, what else are you going to do? You're going to stay stuck on bad information or in a territory or with a map that no longer reflects the territory? That seems like a silly way to go. So I like the saying of strong opinions loosely held.
Yeah, that's one of my favorite sayings. I like map with the territory change. That's good as well. Although most people can't picture a physical map anymore. But as I mentioned, so a year ago you were on, that was episode 257. It was one of our most popular ever. I encourage people to listen to that, get more into your background. We'll talk a little bit more about the last year. We've been writing about some similar stuff, which was I was excited to have you back. One of those topics and that you wrote about recently, I thought was super interesting, was the endangered state of normality. Can you help define what you mean by that?
Yes. So I am a kid of the 80s and the 90s. And as I was growing up in the 80s and the 90s, normality to me felt like it was a very broad concept. Most people were quote unquote normal,
Yeah.
right? And then there were some people who didn't fit into that range. And we were able to, both as a society, to varying degrees of success, but also more personally feeling like, oh, okay, that's part of it, right? That's part of what defines normality is most of us. And then that definition is drawn by the fact there's a few folks who are outside of that. And
Yeah.
sometimes they're outside of that in very positive ways. And however it is culturally or musically or otherwise, oh, there's someone who's out there and they're a huge success because of that. And other times they're outside of normality in not so good ways, right? They are not a net positive to society or whatever. And the old way of dealing with that was saying, do you know what? That's not normal. Like that was a saying that if it didn't apply to some superstar, meant that wasn't good.
Right.
And that norms, which is where normality comes from, norms are actually healthy, actually help contain society in a productive path. They can also be stifling. They can also be oppressive. But I think we've realized I've certainly realized in the last 10, 15 years, all these norms that you find are slightly stifling, whatever, they're there for a reason. And they're holding the whole thing together in a way that if you just start picking apart all the norms and make all of them optional and everything becomes, you just do your thing. And the most important principle becomes consent, and consent alone, that as long as you're a willing participant, you should just do whatever you want. I think we eventually end up in a place we don't want to be. And this is the weird thing about both norms and tradition and even whole belief systems like religion and otherwise, that it's very difficult to diagnose which are the bearing pillars and how much you can remove from the shared culture before things start caving in. And I got a really vivid illustration of that when I moved back to Denmark during the pandemic. I'm originally from Denmark. I lived there for the first 25 years of my life before I immigrated to the US, and now I've stayed in the US for almost 20 years. But I just had this spell of 3 years after having been out for a very long time, coming back into Danish society and realizing, holy smokes, this society is packed with social norms, packed with what's acceptable and what's unacceptable. And society is enforcing those norms. If you are not normal in the negative sense of that, you don't get to just ruin it for everyone else. And on the one hand, I remember when I first left Denmark back in 2005, I would tell people about this thing called janteloven. And janteloven, the law of Jante, is essentially a set of prescriptions that go something like, don't think you're something special. Don't stand out. It's sort of the Brits call it tall poppy syndrome. And that is sort of a set of norms that sound very negative, certainly to American ears when you hear it for the first time, right? You sound like that's just stifling. You're just trying to make everyone conform. And there's truth to that, but there's certainly also benefit. And I realized that as we moved with our family back to Copenhagen in, 2002. And little time into this pandemic, things open up somewhat. There's a whole discussion there about how you handle pandemics and so forth. But let's put that aside for a second and just focus on the fact that my 9-year-old son could take the metro by himself at 9:00 at night. And not only was that totally normal, that was what his friends in Copenhagen were doing too. I didn't feel like I had something particular to worry about because a norm enforcing culture such as the Danish rewards you in a bunch of ways that are not necessarily that apparent until you're in it and you realize, I would never in a million years let my 9-year-old son go down in the subway in New York City. and just go like, oh yeah, you take
There,
a
there
trip.
was a guy who did that, and he was on every news station in America. And the guy
He
wrote the
might
free
very well
range
have been
parenting
arrested,
book. Yeah, yeah,
right? And I've been struggling with this, and maybe we'll get into that topic about free
yeah,
range childhoods. And I think it's actually one of the parts of American society I'm most sort of disappointed about, or
yeah,
critical about, or just annoyed about, is the fact that the freedom of children has shrunk to such a degree that it almost is like a lot of them are under full-time surveillance in a sort of prison where they can't do much of anything by themselves, and they're constantly being chaperoned. And I think that's really not good. And I think this is one of the things that Jonathan Haidt covers
yeah.
in a lot of his writings about what we've done to childhood. I think, unfortunately, he's then gone into focusing a little bit too much on those screens. Also an important point, also an important topic. I'm not saying it's not important, but I actually think the greater importance lies with
Is the
what's been
cultural.
happening with childhoods. And seeing that contrast, seeing the contrast of a norm-heavy society that won't let a homeless person or homeless people just pitch tents all over a public park, because then that means that I can't go there with my kids to enjoy the park. It's very different, right? Like, it's a very different response
Right.
to what happens in society. And what I find so fascinating is in this contrast is that, especially on the American left, Denmark, generally speaking, is held up as this pivotal of like, we should all get to Denmark. Wouldn't it be nice if we had public transportation and
Yeah.
you could walk everywhere and children could just, yeah, okay, you want all those nice things, but you don't want to do what it takes to get those nice things. And those nice things are only possible because of this norm enforcement, because of the fact that we will not tolerate something outside of normality when it's a net negative to society.
Look, there's some that presents some interesting pros and cons. Like, obviously, the problem with a lot of norms is they don't serve the people that fall out of them, and they're ostracized or otherwise. On the flip side, and this is what I'm fascinated about, all of the, postmodernists and socialists, all that stuff, like, we are not that different than animals as human, except we figured out a way in society to come up with some basic rules so our societies can live and function. I think I get to do whatever I want. I understand the personal liberty piece of it, but trying to organize a society around that without anything you agree on, it's a theoretical concept. It won't, and it hasn't worked. If we just take 8 billion people and make them all free agents, doing whatever they want to do, it will look like I can't explain what it would look like, right?
Well, you can look at San Francisco. You can look at a lot
Yeah,
of cities in the US who've tried to. If you were able to just be an alien observing Earth and having no
yeah,
personal stake in the outcome of human life, you'd go, these are really interesting experiments. What if you just allow people to live on the street and shoot up fentanyl or whatever as they so please, and what we will do is just supply them with clean needles and a hot meal, and then otherwise feel like it is in no way within our bounds to have an opinion about whether people should live like zombies. That is a really fascinating human experiment. And we have had American cities run that experiment sort of for a long time. It's not like they only tried for 6 months and you could go like, oh, if you tried it a little longer, maybe you get different outcomes. I think the outcomes are now pretty clear. And those outcomes are actually so clear that I've personally changed my mind on a bunch of things that were more of the standard liberal orthodoxy that
yeah.
were easier to believe before the experiments had been run in real time in my lifetime. Right? When you go like, all right, if we
Yeah,
just
the
remove all these
problem is there's
social
a
norms.
narrative that if you're doing something under the name of helping people, then there's no accountability for whether it actually works or not, right?
Yes.
That is, yeah,
I mean, if you had presented with me to me the theory of harm reduction, I would probably have gone before seeing how that then transpired. I'd go like, that sounds like a very a nice idea. That sounds like
yeah,
a very compassionate idea. That sounds like something that might work. Maybe if you are an addict and someone sort of helps you not die from being an addict,
yeah.
that's certainly something we should all be in support of, right? Like, maybe you'll just come to your senses eventually and like you'll find your way out of it. That doesn't seem to be what's happening on a mass scale in America. And then, to me, I had to update my mental model. I remember in the mid 2000s thinking we should just legalize all of it. Like, who's to tell me whether I can snort cocaine?
Right. That's the individualist mentality.
That's very much the individualist freedom. Yeah. And I was full in on that. And then two things happened, and they're connected. The first thing that happened was the whole opioid crisis that was driven through the pharmacology, right? Like OxyContin and so on. Here's essentially a regime that says you can get opioids literally from your doctor if you ask nicely, or if your toe hurts, or something else like that. So we've legalized it to some extent. What then happened? Not good things. People were not able to, like, the outcomes we've arrived at, 120,000 Americans dying every year from overdoses. It's just almost unfathomable human catastrophe that is unrolling from that experiment that was based on a premise of consent. As long as someone wants to take fentanyl, like, who are we to tell them whether that's right or wrong? It's just an abject failure up there with some of those other abject failures of, let's say, the 20th century and certain ideologies that might very well have been founded on some noble intentions and whatnot, but then turns out to be just these hell on earth scenarios where you can go, hey, you can also propose a critique of, say, capitalism or American society and go, like, there are problems with this, and you would be correct.
Yeah.
The problem is when then your theories of what the alternative should be like turn out to be just catastrophically worse. You should have the humility to go back and revisit your priors, update your mental models. That's what I've been trying to do. Now, of course, what's so fascinating about this is the ability to continue to believe an ideology that's been proven wrong in the wild almost requires a PhD. You almost have to be exceptionally smart to be so stupid. Not accept
or academic, because I was going to say before, I think business people inherently around parenting and a bunch of other things say what, like, they're just used to, when something doesn't work, you stop doing it and you change the inputs. And policy and government people, like, they just, it seems to just not have that discussion. Like, we'll have to come back for episode 3 on parenting, because I could go into that for hours, but like, I would argue we're in a 20-year experiment with a new type of parenting that has produced, like, just catastrophic outcomes. And yet no one's like, maybe we should change that. They're sort of doubling down on it.
That's what was really so pivotal to me about reading Bad Therapy.
Yeah.
The new book by Abigail Shrier.
We talked about this before the show. Yeah. We're both big fans of this book. And I said to you, I've told all of my friends to read this book. It will make a lot of people uncomfortable, but it reminds me a little bit of Jonathan Haidt's Coddling the American Mind when it came out 5 or 6 years ago, in terms of, like, it was a little canary in the coal mine. People would be like, you have no proof of this. You just feel like this book is going to age really well, and that if people are fighting it now, but you're going to come to, look, Abigail was canceled pretty much years ago. And then people have come around to that, issue that she talked about in that book. You just get the sense this is ahead of its time a little bit.
And what's so fascinating about that book, and the reason why I think you're very much likely to be right, is that we are running simultaneous experiments in different parts of the world. And this is why I brought up the example about Denmark. Denmark and the Danish society has a very different approach to parenting that is way more akin to, like, an 80s America in terms of latchkey kids, and that whole idea that it's actually good for children to be unsupervised for long periods of time and figuring the world out on their own, and so on and so forth. That's still, largely speaking, a reality in Denmark, and you're having different outcomes, and you can see it in all the KPIs on children that they are having different outcomes. There's some overlap, there's some shared pathologies here, and it's hard to figure out exactly what, but the degree is very different. And when I read Bad Therapy, I just thought, like, I wish I could hand this out exactly as you were saying to every parent at every school and every institution I've ever been in and involved in America, because it is so apt, so uncomfortably pinpointing all these over-cuddling instincts that a lot of American parents have. Now, some of that I've also, from the example of, would I let my 9-year-old go on the subway in New York? I would not. Would I let him do it in Denmark? Yes, I would. So there are material differences in the circumstances and the security and so forth. And even I struggle with that, because you look at crime statistics from the 80s and 90s and you're like, how did anyone ever open the door and go outside, right? Like they just look catastrophically bad and worse because they were, right?
But I think she said
and the
you'd have to
90s.
leave your kid out on the curb for 740,000 years before someone would kidnap them or something like
The
that.
kidnapping
right?
thing, that was
Yeah.
always nonsense, right? But
Yeah.
if you just look at overall stats
Base
of
crime,
whatever,
yeah.
violent crime or whatnot, things used to be much worse. So I'm also struggling with that, right? Like I also have that instinct, maybe as I was just saying, I wouldn't let my 9-year-old on the subway in New York, is actually also disproportionate. Like the risk perhaps isn't as high.
Right.
But even so, I think this diagnosis, and especially when it comes to the surveillance part, like some of it is also how Americans live by and large, how kids get from A to B. If everything involves a drive by mommy and daddy, obviously there's a serious curtailment there of individual freedom. So, yes, but anyway, just that whole diagnosis of the fact that not only is the way we're sort of treating children, the amount of freedom we give them, problematic. But the way we're then trying to counter the effects of that setup are just absolutely draconian. Like the way we are shrinking.
Well, the results are horrible. I mean,
out.
she says somewhere in there, if you gave people a cancer drug and their cancer got worse, you would stop doing that,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
We are intervening into mental health situations and doing all of this stuff, and mental health just keeps getting worse.
Yes.
And so again, you have to look at that. But what was interesting, I think, in your article, and maybe bring this sort of full circle, is the solution that you kind of offered around this normalization is expanding the definition of normal. It was actually an empathetic thing, rather than kind of treating everyone who's outside as someone with a problem that needs to be solved. Like, how do you see that taking shape in practice?
So I will speak of the areas of the country I've had some exposure to. In California, the amount of children that I've been exposed to personally who have a diagnosis of some sort and who have a intervention regime that either involves pills or therapy is so wild and so foreign to, again, how I grew up. And this is whatever, maybe we were starting to start like old people back in the 80s, like we would just walk uphill in both directions and whatever. But just this idea that a bunch of children, and then I hear about like why they're on these regimens, and some of the things are like, oh, they can't sit still in class, or they're acting out in certain ways, and I go like, that doesn't sound that not normal to me.
Humans weren't meant to sit down.
I got thrown out of the. Got thrown out of the class.
You even met an entrepreneur who couldn't sit still in class, but instead of saying "sit down and shut up," someone should have said, "Why don't you go stand up?" You know, David Rendell, who you might know, he wrote this book called The Freak Factor. He said, "My entire life, I was told to sit down, shut up, and be quiet, and I literally make my living standing up and talking all day on stages. And if someone had said to me, 'You can make money doing that,' he would have said, 'I'm going to do that.'" Right. So,
and I do think that there was more latitude in decades past to accepting that, you know what? First of all, a lot of that's just boys. And I'll give you one.
And you wouldn't have that problem on a farm. Like you just wouldn't.
No.
Right? You'd be,
But I'll get even more specific in the comparisons here. So I was in Danish public school, right? I think it was 4th grade. I got into a fight in the classroom with my friend, and we were literally just punching each other in the face until like blood was going down the nose. And I think of what would happen in any of the American schools that I've been involved with if that incident had occurred, and it would have been like a whole swarm thing, right? Like we need the full interventions, we need the parents, we need all the things. And then I think of what happened in Copenhagen back in the 80s.
You solved it yourselves.
Basically that.
Yeah.
It was basically that. Like, and we did. We actually did solve it. Punching each other in the face. Again, there's limits to everything, right? Like, this is not a. There should be more violence here. Yeah. Right? Like, don't be silly. But the idea that children should learn to navigate their own interpersonal conflicts, and to some extent, sometimes, especially when it comes to boys, that involves a physical contest, establishing a hierarchy somewhat that I don't think those sensibilities to allow that to happen, they don't exist.
Right.
And I've seen that
You also had to figure out I said that and he lost it on me, right?
exactly,
there's some limits before someone
exactly.
might attack me. Yeah.
Like all of a sudden, it
Yeah.
might be a moderating force to think that I could get punched in the face if I'm a real asshole.
Yeah.
Maybe that's good. Or I don't even think maybe. It is good, right? Like it is good to some extent. And again, you can take it all the way to absurdium in 5 different directions. Let's try not to do that. But just this sense that boys in particular, they do hash out their differences in physical ways. And if you take that away, and isn't that not, I mean, I'm giving the extreme example of 2 kids punching each other in the face.
Yeah.
There's also just the example of playing tag. Like I've had kids in various institutions where they didn't allow tag unless there was a teacher.
I just was reading the Anxious Mind book, and you talked about the rules that were all listed for playing tag in this school. I mean, it almost sounded like a Dilbert comic. Yeah.
And that's where we're going down the wrong path. And by trying to cotton and overprotect, make sure that no one is ever hurt, either because someone says something mean or because they fall in a game of tag and they scrape their knee, we're making these children exceptionally vulnerable and fragile. By not exposing them early, I mean, that's the thesis that Abigail presents, and also Haidt, and that I fully subscribe to, that you need some exposure therapy. And what we've done instead is not only have we taken all of that away, we're running a grand experiment of reverse CBT, reverse cognitive behavioral therapy, where instead of increasing exposure to things that might seem dangerous or difficult or whatever, we're doing the opposite. We're teaching children to avoid all the things, to be more sensitive, right? That's what microaggressions, for example, is here's something you might not even have noticed before, but you know what? If you analyze that word and that tone in just the right way, you can find a way to not only be offended by hurt by it. And then we can extrapolate further that hurt is not just you feeling a little bad. No, it's actually a kind of violence. Now, we are into a way where we're training children and then young adults and then adults to be hypersensitive in all the little ways that the world doesn't always accommodate us. And as you say, is that good? Is that bad? You could have a theoretical discussion about that until you see the results. And the results are in. The children are not better off, right? Like as Abigail would say, after doing all this therapy and all these interventions, shouldn't you expect that things were getting better? No, they're not. They're getting worse. And if they are getting worse, the first thing you got to do is stop digging, right? Like you're in a hole, you're digging, and you're like, this is not working. Stop digging. Start finding somewhere else. And then at the very least, have the humility to just do the intellectual comparison. Are we better off now than we were, say, in 1985 or 1995?
And if not, why, right?
If not, why? And to which extent are the differences between those 2 areas related to the ways we're treating these things? And I don't actually think it's that philosophical. I don't think it's that like remote or abstract why kids, and again, especially boys, and I'm saying this because I have experience with having 3 boys, and that's my main experience, they hate it. My boys absolutely hate this idea that when they are in this situation, that they're under constant supervision to play a game of tag.
Yeah.
And I think back to my own childhood and go like, holy shit, I would have hated that too. And that's not just sort of an anecdote, right? There's a definition of stress that is literally, I think Abigail brings this up in her book, where if you want to introduce stress into a psychological experiment, all you have to do is introduce supervision. Just someone looking at you is in and of itself an injection of stress. Yeah. Like, no wonder the kids are more stressed, more fragile all this way, because they're constantly being supervised in school, out of school, everywhere. And it's not working.
Yeah, I'm doing research for my next book, which actually takes a look at this divergence between what we understand as good leadership and what people are practicing as parenting, because I think it's interesting for those of us in the business world. And, not giving away the opening chapter, but David, if I said to you, look, I'm going to tell you about this employee, you have an employee on your team, and they track all their employees. They constantly interrupt them. They finish their work. They do everything for them. They don't let them make any mistakes. You would be people would be on Glassdoor complaining about this employee. They would be in a remedial program for like, you know, that you're a micromanager and no one wants to work for you. And then this is just but if you just describe the average behavior of a parent, like that's what it is. So what's super interesting to me is that like, we understand that is horrible leadership behavior in the workplace. And then the same people to a lot of extent practice it at home.
It is an enigma to some extent. And I've been trying to figure out, both by reading Abigail and Haidt and others, like the full diagnosis of it. I don't think we fully nailed it. Like, how is it that culture has moved in this way where we all have these impulses all the time in the same way? Like, I'm trying to be conscious about and deal with in different ways. And yet still myself as a parent, like I'm far more interventionist. I'm far more involved than my parents were in the 80s. And I look at all the things that I turned out to be good at and the skills I honed as a young adult. Most of them are related to having to figure things out without having a parent there to guide it all away. Being able to make a bunch of mistakes, some really awful ones along the way, and realizing, oh yeah, do you know what, that wasn't a good idea. And then taking all of that, right? And then figuring out how to transform that into lessons about leadership, about humans in general, what works, what doesn't work. And when I look at, again, if you look at American kids, and this is one of those other contrasts, and it's not to rack on America. I love a lot of things about America. Not this part, but a lot of other things. When I compare the Danish 15-year-olds with the American 15-year-olds I generally meet, I'm like, it feels like there's 5 years difference. It feels like I'm meeting a 10-year-old.
Probably
versus a 15-year-old. Like there's just such a huge gap in, I don't know, the way some people sum it up as maturity. That's a vague word, but there's some sense of you meet a person and you like, oh yeah, that feels like a 15-year-old. In America, and again, I'm sure this is segmented in different parts of the country, have different whatever. There's just a sense that like the kids are kids, small children, longer. Jordan Peterson has this long line of argument around the devouring parent. You want all the good things, the best things for your child, so you try to just hug them and embrace them, and what you end up is choking their ability to grow and blossom and become a functioning adult. And what you have to do is the great tragedy of letting go, and the great tragedy of accepting that when you do let go, some bad things will happen, and those bad things need to happen.
Earlier rather than later, right?
You're producing the human you would want to have as your 25-year-old offspring, right? You're doing harm, literally, by being this overprotective, devouring parent. And the only way to undo that is to let go, is to accept that adversity is a requirement for growth. You literally cannot grow a fully formed, moral, kind, capable adult without exposing the child of that adult to some degree of adversity, of difficulty, of hardship, of personal choices, making bad choices, and standing back, being there. I'm not saying like be completely absentee, although
they know you support them and love them. They're just not there to fix every problem that happens.
Right? And that is very much, I think it's very interesting that you're drawing this parallel to the workforce and the degree to which I've worked with a lot of employees over the 20 plus years of managing other people. And it's exactly as you say, that I need to be there to sort of a little occasional nudge back on the track, right? But unless I let them commit some mistakes and chase down some blind alleys, they're not going to figure it out. And I mean, we've summed this up in teach a man how to fish, don't just give him a fish, right? Like, we're not just about like, I want a specific outcome in one instance. No, I'm trying to train, impart on another individual the capacity such that they can make good choices when I'm not here, right? And that's where it goes to the childhood part. So you do all this overprotective work. And you may very well be able to protect them from hardship and harm in those first 5 years. But there's 80 years left.
Okay.
They have to be alone by themselves and make those personal choices for 80 years. Wouldn't you, even if it pains you, and which parent isn't pained by seeing some hardship to their child, for 5 years or 7 years to realize, all right, there's going to be some hard times, but like, I'm looking at the bigger picture. I'm doing the marshmallow test on my own parenting. I'm not gonna smother it all, need the marshmallow right now. I'm gonna realize, by the way, that one didn't replicate, I believe, as most other things in psychology at the moment. Virtually everything. And I think this is where psychology and parenting could learn a little bit from business, but business could certainly also learn to go back and realize that sometimes all these studies we like to draw on for our business lessons, most of them are not replicating. It's a fascinating topic on its own. But let's just assume that it was true. And I deferred gratification, I think, as a concept is true. There's 80 years left. When you're done, right? When you're done with them.
It doesn't get easier.
It does get easier if
you have the abilities. The problems don't get easier, right? The problem,
right.
Being made fun of for dropping a ball on the playground is generally a low stakes thing. I know it feels like the end of the world, but yeah.
Yes. And they have to feel some degree of shame. They have to feel some degree of hurt and whatever. There's proportions to everything. And again, this is not a thing like, oh, everyone should just be bullied all the time because it's really good for them. No. Don't be silly. But we need some of it. Some
thick skin. So I want to take a total pivot here, because one of the other topics I really wanted to talk to you about, and look, you and Jason over the years have continually made decisions that go like against the grain or the tide or what everyone is clamoring for, and often to a lot of criticism. I don't think you do it to be intentionally confrontational. I think you guys are just strongly principled, maybe sort of impervious to whatever the screaming or the crowd is. And you know, we talked about this, you know, last time. I wrote an article earlier this year about how leaders are just really struggling to manage their core businesses and all the extra duties of ESG and DEI. And I know you talked about how you think that's ending, but I want to go back to, you know, a couple of years ago when, you know, you and Jason were like, look, this is in the middle of all of the fervor of companies should have opinions on everything. And you were like, we're not doing this. We're not doing politics at work. It's not what we're going to do. If you don't like it, we'll help you leave. And you were told you're on the wrong side of history. You guys were told you will regret this, like all this stuff. Turns out you were right. Like, in fact, I just saw a Gallup poll this week. It's down to 38% of Americans want companies to take social stances. And actually, if you dive into that data, it's less, because the things they're saying about like climate change and stuff, I don't think it's a social stance. I think they want their company to like be doing, like, not harming the world, which is, to me, is not a societal stance or a political stance. What all of these things, whether it's raising venture money, changing your name, going against this tide of saying, look, no one will ever work for your company again if you don't become a social advocacy company. Like, what does it take to stay calm in these storms?
It's a good question. And I think I'll point to several factors. And as always, I don't even really know which of the factors are exactly the ones that determine things. But what helped us specifically around the original storm on, should DEI be a core component of the company? Should we run on an equity agenda versus an equality agenda? The difference of trying to ensure that we have default or the same opportunities for everyone, or the same outcomes. Very, very different things, very easily conflated at the absolute core of the rot that DEI brought to a lot of company, right? Focusing on making sure that outcomes are the same for everyone, whether the talents or efforts or inputs are the same or not, versus ensuring that everyone has a chance. I'm very fervent believer in that. And that's how I got sucked in to the good intentions at first, because the line had been made intentionally blurry, that it appealed to people who thought like, oh yeah, this is all about ensuring that everyone gets a fair chance and a fair shot. And then it's up to them to prove whether they have earned it or not. Well, it turned out that wasn't what it was about. And I saw that early on when meritocracy started getting turned into a negative word, that this was actually bad, that first of all, no real meritocracies exist, which Yes, perhaps in some theoretical sense of, is there 100% meritocracy or is there zero? But that's not the world we live in. There's a spectrum of it. And trying to strive for a meritocracy, that is that the most qualified, capable candidates rise to the top and get hired or get promoted, is foundational to everything from a functioning economy to a functioning company. And giving that up or throwing that out at the altar of DEI was just an absolute catastrophic mistake. It took me a while to realize all of this because my natural instincts as this started to wind up was that it spoke to general, I don't know, liberal humanistic sensibility.
And what about companies having opinions too? Can you bring that into that?
That too. Yeah. And I think that's one where I really have changed my mind tremendously by seeing the total sum of it and then using it as a mirror to reflect on my own behavior. I've been very opinionated for a very long time. And for a lot of that time, I've been very opinionated about how other people did other things or ran their companies or operated their things. And we're not afraid of expressing that opinion. But having gone through, especially the last 5 years, and being able to see the kind of either communities within the tech community or the broader economy, what happens when everyone piles in on that train? Yeah. Then I go like, actually, do you know what? I don't want to be as much a part of this as I was before. And I've tried to change my own approach to, for example, criticism online of how loose is my trigger finger before I will clander someone else for something I think they did wrong or otherwise. But either way, we end up in this situation where we are in the eye of the storm, and the easy path was certainly just to roll over, just to say the thing.
And the actual eye was, just to be clear too, people, you sort of said, look, we're no longer allowing political commentary on our internal channels. Like we're not doing politics at work anymore.
Yes. Yeah. We were not going to discuss like the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in our work space. Like this wasn't even about having shut down all discussions. If there are willing participants who want to start a WhatsApp group and during work have some discussions back and forth, do you know what? Okay, whatever. This was specifically about any of those political currents infiltrating and permutating and corrupting the main areas of collaboration that we were using, specifically for us for Basecamp, where we're doing all our messages back and forth. Like in that broad forum, it's inappropriate. We should actually have a norm, which is not a new norm. It's a revival of an old norm. At work, you don't talk about politics, you don't talk about religion, because talking about both of those things are inevitably going to lead to a friction. Unless you have some weird Borg where literally everyone has exactly the same political
which, by the way, is not very aligned, as I've always said, because people say, well, I want my company to agree with me on the opinions and values. And I'm like, well, if everyone agrees, that doesn't sound very diverse to me, right? Like,
I mean, that's one of those internal contradictions that to me was always hilarious, right? We're all about diversity, except if it's about different opinions. Wait, what? What does that word even mean then? And there's a whole discussion there. But we just went like, do you know what? First of all, this isn't working. This wasn't actually coming from a theoretical, abstract discussion of, I wonder what would happen if we did this more. No. It was coming from a very concrete set of
It was hurting your culture. Yeah.
This was happening. It is hurting the culture. It's hurting the company. It's turning this company into a company I don't want to work at, let alone own. That seems bizarre. Jason and I own this company. We've worked in this company for 20 years. Are we going to let it turn into a company we don't like, let alone want to be at? This is, by the way, just to tie it to the parenting thing, one of Jordan Peterson's most searing commentaries here is to ensure that your children grow up to be adults that you would want to be around. Yeah. And I think of that in the same way with the company. I have to ensure as the co-owner of this company that this company grows up or continues to be a place I want to work. Because if I don't even want to work there, I should be the most passionate about wanting to work there, right? If I don't want to work there, how could I ask anyone else to come in and do the job here? So we felt like, all right, we have to make a change. We cannot live in this shadow realm of just biting our tongue because it's having such a detrimental effect. Now, when we then went on and said, okay, no more politics at work, the company at large is not going to take public stances anymore. I think we did one, maybe two awful public statements on current thing political stuff that was posted to the blog, probably around BLM or something like that, and just felt like I want to throw up. Like, this is so antithetical to how I want this company to operate, what I want it to stand for, and it's even abstract and removed from the specifics of whatever the current thing was. It's just like, this is disgusting. And so what do you do with that disgust? Well, a lot of folks have forces on them that ensures that they will just swallow. They will just go like, they'll grit their teeth and they will say the incarnations like, there's more work to be done. There was a wonderful article at, I think, 2020 or something that summarized statements around, I think, BLM or something like that, George Floyd, 141, I believe, CEOs from major companies saying exactly the same line, like literally verbatim, there's more work to be done in the context of all this stuff. We just go like, that's, by the way, kind of freaky. You can't get 140 CEOs to agree on virtually anything of any kind, right? All of a sudden, they're speaking as one Borg about this. This is not voluntary. This is performative. And it's performative in a sort of survivalist way, right? Like, I'm not even performing just because I like the adoration. I'm performing because I think my company would be destroyed. And I will be destroyed unless I say the thing.
And what's interesting there is, like, you could argue destroyed from, you're worried about outside forces or inside forces.
Both.
Right? Yeah.
Both. That was the real surprise for me, I would say, was the degree to which I've always sort of had I don't know if always, I had developed a relatively thick skin for strangers having opinions about my work. I think that is a good thing to develop, generally speaking, if you want to do something creative, innovative, different, because you are inevitably going to get a bunch of haters who just dislike it, and they will say so online. And I said, like, all right, whatever. The new dynamic in that situation, especially once Twitter became this incredible force, was that it would ricochet back and forth, that the outside criticism wouldn't just hit me. No, it would hit deep inside and splinter inside the company. And then it would hit a bunch of folks who were not in any way exposed or had developed that thick skin, who didn't have 20 years of being in the public eye and being responding to these public comments, and they would be a lot more fragile, and a lot of them would shatter. And I saw that dynamic go like, this is, first of all, this is a new phenomenon. I've never seen this before. The way Twitter and the mob mentality was able to reach that deep into the innards of a company and then just rip it apart.
It was a Salem witch hunt type fervor, really.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. There was a lot of that. And whatever.
And by the way, if you're labeled a witch, like, there's no defense that you're not a witch. Right. So,
and that was, I mean, we trended for that specific thing. We trended, I think, for like 36 hours on Twitter. And I think at the time I counted something like 20,000 or 30,000 tweets. And a lot of them were literally like the witch label of the day, which was, you're a Nazi, you're a white supremacist, you're whatever. All on the basis of, we don't want to discuss politics. Like, it wasn't even, weren't even taking a hard stance on one way or the other.
Yeah, you weren't saying one, right. And so how many people left in the end?
About 20. So about a third of the company, which 20 doesn't sound like that much, but a third does, right? And it was a big change for the company. And one that at the time, I didn't know how that was going to play out. What happens when a third leaves? Also, are we ever going to be able to hire someone again? I
was just going to say, but then tell me about what happened with your applications.
With the applications?
Job applications. Didn't they spike, right? Like, there was a lot of people who wanted this.
Yeah, that was the whole concept of, what do you call it, revealed preferences and falsification cascades. I forget specific terms. This idea that when you see something like that, you also feel it. There's a mob on Twitter. It feels like it's literally the world. Like when 20,000 individuals show up in your mentions and they all call you a Nazi or a white supremacist, it doesn't feel like 20,000. It feels like 8 billion. It feels like it's literally everyone, because you only
the inkling is to cave, right? The easy thing to do there, what most people would do is, we got it wrong and we're sorry, we'll cave. As you said, throwing up in their mouth saying it because they don't believe it, right?
Yes. Now, the irony, perhaps, that got revealed a little later when a lot of people did it. It didn't help. Like once you've been declared a witch, capitulating, it's not going to save you from the stake. You will still get burned. And in some ways, you're now just going to be burned double in both directions. So, but still, I can totally see why someone would arrive at, I just have to wave the white flag, even if it means my destruction, because the pressure, and I say as someone who literally had 20 years of training on adversarial,
you were not a public
internet
figure.
commentary, right?
Yeah.
It was the hardest, if you take it on something that lasts for more than like an hour, it was the hardest period of my professional life. And in retrospect, I am eternally grateful for the experience. And it's one of those very strange things that has
anti-fragility.
Exactly. It's one of those things that there's a great saying of, I asked what was it? I asked for things to be easier, but what I needed to be was stronger. Right? Like you don't actually want things easier. You want to be stronger. You want to be able to carry more, heavier, longer. That's the way to grow as an individual, as a leader, as a business owner. And that experience really forced me to that. It also, as we started out talking about, I enjoy receiving new information and updating my map. I enjoy realizing that I was wrong about certain things because that's a gift. If I'm wrong about reality, it's a gift to be shown that. It's a gift to update your mental models because now you are more accurately able to understand the world around you. And at that moment, I did not understand the world I was living in. And it actually took a substantial degree of literal study to understand the lineage of some of these ideas. Because at the time when you're in it, well, actually, before you're in it,
like, why do people believe I'm a Nazi? Even though I don't agree with them, it's really important to understand that, right?
Yes, it is. Because the natural thing, and I think this is where, especially the whole DEI cult thing, has been so effective at exploiting the good qualities of Western society, right? Like the good qualities of culture born out of Christianity, like, oh, we want to sympathize with the oppressed, and we want to take we want to turn the other cheek, we want to do all these things, right? Unfortunately, all of those very noble qualities can open up these exploit vectors where people, not in good faith, use those as avenues to just destroy you. And I wanted to understand that. I wanted to understand the lineage of these ideas. And going on that intellectual journey was just eye-opening. And I'm ever so thankful. I don't know if I would have gone on that exploration. I don't know if I would have read Thomas Sowell. I don't know if I would have discovered the Frankfurt School and Herbert Marcuse and the ideology, or not the ideology, the plan of the long march through the institutions. All of these things, all these concepts that you can trace back literally in the most direct sense, 60 years back. The whole game plan was written in the late 60s on how do we do this. And I mean, by the way, not only just understanding it, but also in some weird, perverse way, like respecting it, like having that far of a time horizon for overturning sort of norms in society. Like that's kind of impressive in the way you could look at some evil mastermind in a Marvel movie and go like that.
It's a long game, yeah.
One sly fella. So just going through all of that and then coming out on the other side and first not knowing what was going to happen. Are we going to get destroyed? Is the business over? I mean, this was one of the things we legitimately thought at the time. Okay, we've lost a third of our employee base. What happens if you lose another third? I mean, then you gotta just turn off the lights? Is that it? Like, how does this end? And not knowing that, going through that uncertainty was in itself also just a blessing. It was a challenge. There's a great book called
Right. What would you do? It's like fear setting. You start thinking about, okay, so how would I solve that, right?
Yes. First of all, there's a problem. You got to solve it. You don't know how it's going to go. You don't know even the extent of the problem. You don't understand all the forces. That's just an intellectual, almost riddle you got to figure out. And that's interesting. And then it's also, there's a wonderful book called The Comfort Crisis, which relates to some of these things we've been talking about with childhood and how we've all grown very, very comfortable. Like that is what the advanced civilizations offers. You're never cold. You're never hungry. None of those things, right? The Comfort Crisis is a wonderful book trying to interrogate what that does to a person, and is that ultimately just good in all the ways? And the conclusion is no, it's not. Like, it's not good to be comfortable literally 100% of the time. You end up flappy and fragile. And that book has a wonderful term for trying to actively combat that by exposing yourself to difficult situations, called a misogi. And a misogi is essentially a quest. We're going to try something that is deliberately difficult and uncomfortable and unsure of success. And usually it's a physical challenge. In the book, he talks about going to Alaska for a month to hunt whatever, elk or something, and living in very harsh conditions for a month, and how that was very difficult. I saw this exploration as sort of a corporate misogi. And you really got to be careful before things get really cheesy when you blend those two worlds, but I'm going to do it anyway. That misogi of this is really difficult. It's psychologically difficult. And as a sort of secondary, it's actually physiologically difficult. This was one of the things. I was wearing the Oura ring at the time when this was happening, and the stats I was getting from my sleep was as if I had the flu. I could see sort of heart rates and whatever, all those things. It was basically like having the flu, which was just fascinating in itself.
Interesting, because I missed the story. It just seems like you guys didn't care, right? Because we were going to do what we do, but that's not it. Like this was this really, yeah.
And I think that not only did we care, and not only were we like heavily invested in it, I think that's actually why I've now a little removed from it, look back on it with such. I was about to say joy. That is very much the wrong word.
Appreciation.
Meaning, that there was so much meaning in that, exactly because it was difficult, exactly because it was not as obvious as just say like, I don't care. All right, a third leaves. Who gives a damn? Some of these people I'd worked with for 10 years. Like, there were deep personal relationships that just got severed right in the middle. I don't want to use, I was almost about to use one of those modern words that bad therapy has helped me not use as much, which was, I was about to say was traumatic. Yeah. It was not traumatic. It was not the beaches of Normandy. None of that shit. But and this is where level setting comes in, right? We live in this overly comfortable world. So when something like this happens, it feels like it's a trauma, even though, I mean, that's a preposterous notion or label to put on this. But either way, it was difficult. And that's why I'm very proud, in retrospect, of the fact that we were able to stick with it, that we were able to not fold, to not just capitulate, and not just try to see if we could get mercy from people who were not going to show us any. Yeah. That we were able to go like, do you know what? This might destroy the company. And that was actually one of the things when Jason and I first set off to this. We had no idea it was going to blow up like this. But we did know it was going to be controversial. And we did go into it almost like with a pact of, do you know what? We dislike the trajectory of the company as it's going right now so much that if the price of trying to arrest that development is that we destroy the company, I will accept that reality. And I think that ability, not just intellectually, but also economically, to accept that reality was key. Most people, as I said, they have these pressures. CEOs say these things they don't mean, and then they throw up in their mouth afterwards because they have a board, because they're on unemployment, because they have investors, because they have all these other stakeholders who will force them to do the thing they don't want to do. We didn't have any of those. Not only had Jason and I been running a profitable software company for 20 years and long since reached escape velocity on the base necessities of life, we didn't have a board. We didn't have anyone else to force us to do things that we didn't want to do. In fact, we had no one to tell us that we couldn't do the things we saw to be necessary. I am certain that if we had taken our plan and how we were going to do it to a professional board full of people representing investors and whatnot, they would have told us, are you absolutely out of your mind? Absolutely not. Just post the thing. Say the thing.
Or I'll take that a step further. After the reaction, they probably would have fired you or told you to take it back, right? Yeah. And then, but what happened? What happened after? So what was the day after the storm? Now, I know you've gotten private phone calls and people who told you you'd be on the wrong side of history apologizing, but what happened to the company?
A great deal of uncertainty. What was going to happen. We had about 2 weeks that were highly uncertain. Is the survival of the company even in jeopardy? We thought it was for a moment. And then quite quickly, you go from like all the alarms are flashing, everything is red, the sirens are going. Those things turn off. And you
The
first of all,
mob moves on to the next witch too.
yes.
Yeah.
So that's really important, right? Like there was 2 weeks where the news coverage was on us, the Twitter intensity was on us, and so forth. And then obviously there was a long tail of sort of just the aftershocks of a thing like that. But it goes away quite quickly. And that is one of those other things, which is, if you go back to sort of Stoic philosophy and so on, I think it's, I don't know if it was Seneca or
Marcus
Aurelius,
probably, yeah.
that goes like, if you can bear it, bear it. Right? Why are you complaining? Yeah. Either you can bear it and you will bear it, or you can't and you will perish. We weren't perishing, so bear it, right? If you could withstand it, as we did for those 2 weeks that really felt like it's the end of the world, you come on the other side like, oh shit, it wasn't. And now, even further removed, I mean, your mind does all these tricks and it compresses all the things that it doesn't like and it just emphasizes the things it does like. But it doesn't look trivial, but it does. It certainly wasn't trivial, but it looks a lot less catastrophic to some extent than it was, and it certainly ended up being that way. The first thing we thought was, okay, if this mob is representative of the 8 billion people in the world, literally every customer is going to leave us tomorrow. So that was the first thing where you just go like, okay, is the business over, or like everyone going to cancel? And we saw an initial small spike from our consumer product on the email product side. And then we saw a small or not even a larger sign up spike, as in people signing up for our stuff on the Basecamp side. And in the end, it was a bit of a wash. Yeah. So the business itself, if you were an external observer and you didn't
you traded the people who wanted to make software product decisions based on politics for people who decidedly did not want to make software decisions based on politics.
Yes.
Right. Yeah.
And it turns out, first of all, that there's lots of people who had no interest whatsoever in working in a place that was heavily invested in being an activist organization, or even not even that, just weighing in on these things, right? Including at our own company. Tons of employees would reach out afterwards and say, like, I know this is really difficult, but what we had before clearly was not also working. I was very uncomfortable being in a situation where if you expressed any divergence of opinion to the mainstream orthodoxy of the left, that was going to be difficult. You were going to be ostracized quite quickly. So there was that whole factor of it. And then there was the factor that the business itself, if you had just seen those things, you could barely have told that something happened. So this is where these different realities coexist at the same time. If you're like just on Twitter all the time, you think the world is ending. If you close that app, it's almost like nothing's happening, which is such a fascinating.
You do it to yourself, like, right?
Yes,
like,
you do it to some extent. You do it to yourself to some extent, and this is again where the Stoics just go like, it's not what happens; it's your reaction to it, and we're hurt so much more in our imagination than we are in reality. And as it turns out, not only was the business fine, not only were the majority of people who worked at the business, if not happy with the eventual outcome, none of them were happy going through what we went through. But sort of looking for it, there was a whole world of folks who were very interested in working at a place like that. And we ended up hiring amazing people who were more than capable of taking over from the folks who saw sort of that advocacy as their main thing. Now, the other thing, too, is even though a third of the company left, it wasn't like that whole third were fully paid up members of the activist brigade. There was a small section, which was a really interesting lesson for me. There's maybe 3, maybe 4, 5 at the most who were sort of the hardcore group, who were able, through the power of this part mind virus and part these pression tactics, to essentially get a much larger group behind it. Even if that group wasn't fully
did that other group come back? Did that second group come back? Did some of them come back?
No. I mean, those bridges.
Yeah.
Had
well, they were probably also a little embarrassed. People, I find when a lot of people who want to go back when they've made a bad decision don't want to admit that.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly got that afterwards in the year that followed. Quite a lot of commentary, not from former employees, but folks who at the time had picked up a pitchfork and was part of the mob and thought they were on the right side of history, who then after a few years realized they were actually kind of embarrassed about that, which I have great sympathy for, because I've been embarrassed about positions that I've taken. I've been embarrassed about ways that I've joined parts of mobs at certain times. And I've tried to reflect on that, learn from it, and change my operating system, such that when those instincts inevitably bubble up, which they do in all people, right? Like this righteous rage about something being wrong in the world, especially if you see a few more other people are on that same rage trip. It's a very powerful emotion. It's a very seductive emotion. And you need a layer on top that goes like, okay, I'm feeling that. I don't have to act on that. I don't have to go to Twitter immediately to tweet on that. I can let it dissipate. I can sit for a moment and just feel those emotions and watch that cloud like go over me and then disappear. And that's a really powerful ability to have, to accept that these emotions are inevitable, that this is just part of the human condition and experience, but not act on them, to allow your
24-hour rule has always been a good
rule.
rule. The sleep on it rule, right? This is yeah.
That was literally one of the things I took away from this. That sleeping on it in and of itself, it's so funny. It's one of those traditions where, I mean, we heard of that. Probably 2,000 years ago, you'll find some quote to like, you should just sleep on it. Because literally it works, right? It literally, all that emotion that's high in the moment.
Like, that's not a big deal the next day. Yeah.
And suddenly it seems inconsequential, or it's certainly not that important. And even more than just sleep on it, especially in this case, was suspend judgment. Jason, my business partner, has a wonderful thing of how we operationalize this in product development. He calls it give it 5 minutes. And in product development, usually all you need is 5 minutes. You have this initial reaction to a new design, a new color of a button, and you just go like, oh, I don't like it. And then you give it 5 minutes and you're like, actually, it's fine. For some of these bigger topics, you got to give it a little more than 5 minutes. And I found that giving almost anything like 2 weeks, or at least just a couple of days, will radically change how emotionally invested I am in it and enable me to see much more clearly, where do I want to be on this?
Yeah. And like I said, it's turned out well. And I think what not only you're seeing the people who regret their pitchforks, but they're dealing with the consequences of this in their organization, having gone in on something they weren't, where they were virtually signaling they didn't believe in it, getting distracted from their product, getting all types of people who don't agree with each other and are fighting over it. And they're, it's not just that they feel bad, I think, but they're actually, they realize they chose a path that has a lot of problems for them.
Yes. And again, I have great sympathy for that, because I've been on similar intellectual journeys where I thought I was quite convinced about things being one way, and then I learned they were another. And that is, I think, difficult for most people. It's certainly also difficult for me, but I've learned to take almost a perverse liking to it. This updating of the mental models, updating of the maps, through the realization that what you want is accuracy towards the terrain. Like that's actually what's enjoyable. It's not holding the map. It's being able to get to where I want to go. And that requires that the map matches the terrain. Now, what's so interesting too here is that all this has happened so quickly. So quickly. I mean, if you think of this incident we're talking about at our company happened in 2001, it is literally only 3 years ago. You could have been convinced me that it was at least a decade in the past. And not only is it only 3 years ago, for a year after, we were still in the thick of that in the tech industry. It's only really been in the last, let's say, 18 months where the clouds have started to part and sun has come in, which it's also just a reflection of how adaptable we are as humans. Like, I don't think about this in the same way at all as I used to. It was a very present thing all the time in almost all the interactions and observations about tech. And now it's kind of quite removed. And yet you get these reminders that that's not an evenly distributed sensibility. The launch of Google's Gemini AI to me was one of those great reminders. Like, that just happened a few months ago, where you go ask it, show me a picture of George Washington, and you get something laughable back, right? Like, show me Nazi soldiers. And again, you go like, who would ship this product? How does this make it into the market? Oh, it makes it into the market by an organization that has been completely captured. And what's been so fascinating to witness is the degree to which these companies are trying to correct, and how they're trying to essentially put up the appearance that there's no correction happening. At our company, the correction was very visible and was very public, right? Like, it was very, like, we're just changing course. And
we also said it. You said, we did this, we lost the employees. Like you weren't hiding that there was a consequence of it.
Versus if you look at some of the large tech companies now, it's kind of leaking out the back door. Oh, we've cut 80% of DEI openings. We've cut these DEI offices. We've cut all this machinery and bureaucracy.
There's no announcement about it. Yeah.
And yet they're not through, right? Like Google is still going through it. Like there's a lot of organizations that are in various stages of this intellectual cancer. And maybe they're making some headway and some progress, but there's a lot of infection left to go. So it'll be really interesting to see where it goes. But what's also been so fascinating is how the overtone window almost does feel like it's been binary. Like Twitter was one way, and then literally in 3 months, it's transformed into a very different way. And this is where we come into these other factors. To which degree that was just culture that moved? To which degree is that outside influences like Elon Musk buying Twitter and taking this intellectual cuddle away from the hardcore activists, and suddenly they don't have the enforcement mechanism anymore, and then the whole house of cards just collapses when you can't police the narratives and force cancellations and all the other injunctions that they were able to put through. I don't quite know, but I've been just truly fascinated as it feels like we're speed running through history. And yet I think that, and I think, oh, this must be something novel. This must be something new. Is it Stalin that says sometimes nothing will happen in decades, and other times decades will happen in a few minutes? That is,
but doesn't that make you think that like there's this romanticized sort of notion in the moment of, you know, again, Dave, are you going to be on the wrong side of history, like in these capitulation moments? But it's kind of like some wine turns to vinegar and some wine gets really good. I know Nassim Taleb said, I don't judge a book that hasn't been written for 10 years. Like, how can you possibly know if it will hold the test of time? But we're making decisions in a moment because that's the Twitterverse, and not like over time. Like all the articles would have said Basecamp are morons if you wrote that article in a 24-hour window. And now they say, well, the guys at 37 Signals were brilliant because so it just, I don't know. It just seems like we got to give things a little more time before we put the final stamp on, did it work or did it not work?
And that's very difficult to do. It's very difficult to accept that in the moment, you don't know. You cannot predict the future. One of the things I've really been humbled on, not just that experience, but a lot of things that happened during COVID and a lot of sort of official proclamations about this is the way things are. This is the way vaccines work. This is the way we must act. This, that, and the other thing. Turned out that there were so many incidents of that in such a short period of time that turned out to be just laughably incorrect.
Yeah.
And that was sort of presumably the best knowledge of establishment of experts just being absolutely catastrophically, almost hilariously wrong. That leads you to believe, first of all, okay, maybe experts aren't actually as experty as I should like to believe. This is where Thomas Sowell's book, Knowledge and Decisions in particular, was really instrumental to help me understand that. Like, why is that? Why is it that even people who have studied certain things for decades and have PhDs and long degrees in something can be so wildly wrong and wildly incapable of seeing things that someone far less learned can just witness right in front of their eyes? That's fascinating, right? Like, I've come from some perhaps naive or default thoughts of like, all right, the more you know, the better you are at predicting things and the more accurate you'll be and so on. And that has really had a difficult time on a lot of topics over the last 5 years. And then you end up realizing, okay, do you know what? It's not just about academics being laughably wrong. There's some interesting stuff in that. It's about all of us.
And you can understand, I actually think you can understand if people are wrong and if you had to make decisions under rush judgment. What's crazy to me, this is the thing that's, it is September 2024. We have, if we have a global pandemic tomorrow, we have no agreement on what we have learned, what we would do differently, like where we got it right, where we got it wrong. Right. I'm actually okay if someone says, look, in the moment in March 2020, like we said this and we didn't freaking know, but like if we had to do it again, but there has been no commission, it's actually staggering.
It is. And what's also interesting with that is not evenly distributed either. So I was in Denmark during the pandemic. And one of the things I was most impressed with was exactly the Danish government's and society's capacity to update its priors. So, for example, once the vaccines came out for kids, Denmark did a big program saying everyone all kids, I think 6 years and up, should get a vaccine. And they ran that program, I think, for about 6 months. There wasn't a big uptake. This is one of the things where the wisdom of the crowds, prediction markets theory is surprisingly interesting here, right? There was some natural inclination where a lot of parents were skeptical. Maybe they couldn't exactly articulate why, but they picked up on something. Then all these studies came in showing that, you know what, this is not proportionate. The potential harm here, the likelihood of bad outcomes from a healthy 14-year-old getting COVID just do not stand up under scrutiny to the unknowns of these fast-tracked vaccines. And then they changed course. Today, the official Danish policy on vaccines and boosters is that unless you're over 60 or you have sort of a certain inventory of illnesses, you're not getting anything. Like, it's not even optional. Like, we're not going to offer you, for example, a booster or a vaccine. And even further, I mean, that's not that controversial today, although I suppose for some people it will be. But at the time, when the U.S. was pushing that all kids should get the vaccine, Denmark had updated its priors and was able to adjust its approach because perhaps to some extent it hadn't gotten politicized, right? Like, things in the U.S. with that specific instance and with many others got coded politically very quickly. Oh, you're skeptical about vaccines? That codes your right wing. You take as many boosters as you're given? That codes you as being in good standing on the left wing, which is a really tragic way of trying to understand the world and learn and update. And then, as you say, you end up going like, we don't know. We have no consensus on what we should do differently. But then I also think, was it ever otherwise? I mean, I know that there are certain metrics where you can see like, greater sort of disagreement and the size that there's ever been. Congress is more divided than ever and so forth. But I mean, you look back on the Vietnam War, for example. This is one area I like to focus on when trying to contextualize this. Late 60s to early mid 70s. Holy shit. I mean, most people have some idea of what that history is. Go back and look at some of the actual things that were going on. Just cities across the country, like just burning, like the absolute students getting shot at Penn State. Like, there was just the amount of violence and disagreement and sort of feeling like the country's coming apart. Like, it's not like that's completely
even without Twitter
to the American experience.
Even without Twitter. Yeah.
Even without Twitter. That's exactly it, right? That's exactly it. We have, as every person, generation, society has, we have a now bias. We have a now focus. Like, this must be the first time it's ever been this bad. It must be the first time we've ever been this divided. All right, so there's the 60s, there's the Vietnam War, there's the Civil War. I mean, come on, let's just accept here, America has had some incidents where that's been happening, but we are so, as humans, I think, regression averse. This is one of the things, for example, on the crime thing. We talked about how violent crime, for example, in the 80s and 90s were substantially far above anything it even peaked at in recent memory. But this feeling of, I lived in Wicker Park in Chicago. And I lived there for, 6-7 years. And when I moved in, there was still a little area with a little sketch. Then things got really nice. It got gentrified. That to the left is a bad word. To me, it's a great word. It means that actually there's not as much crime and things settle down and things get upgraded and we will, whatever. That's its own discussion. But I started just seeing strollers and kids and whatever everywhere. A hallmark of A, gentrification, and B, things are just getting safer. And then that curve broke. I think it was like 19 or 20. And all of a sudden, there'd be a month where I would hear from my friends still living in the neighborhood, oh yeah, in March, there were 21 carjackings. Wicker Park is like 8 city blocks. 21 carjackings in a month. That was crazy in comparison to the world that existed very briefly before that. Yeah. There were no carjackings that month. There was not, like, you didn't have to worry about taking your stroller out on the street and getting shot. And again, if you compare that to the 80s was probably still worse. I don't know exactly on carjacking in that environment, but overall, it was still worse. What felt so traumatic, again, now I'm using that word, it's so ingrained. Let's not unwind. Not traumatic. What felt so stark was the change, right? Like, all of a sudden it was here, and all of a sudden we dipped humans are so bad. They have such loss aversion.
Right. That have we seen this before? Right. Even the dip might have been the aberration. Right.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. I mean, that has, for example, murder statistics in the USA peaked, I think, in 21, and then actually has recovered very substantially. There's still problems also over in all sorts of other crime and reporting and whatnot. But murders is a good bellwether to some degree because there's not a lot of fudging the data. There's not like, oh, is it getting reported or not? No, do you know what? If someone's dead, they're going to show up at the morgue and someone's going to count them, and you can add those numbers up. So all of that is just to say that, like, we don't know. we are, and we should have more humility about the fact that we don't know, and we should have less certainty. And that, for someone like me, who is, as Thomas Sowell would put it, a solutionist, right? Like, I try to look for solutions. There's a problem, let's solve it. Yeah. Versus Thomas Sowell goes, as many other conservative thinkers go, like, do you know what? There are no solutions. There are only trade-offs.
That's an interesting point. Yeah. The one solution creates a new problem. So it's just a cycle.
Yeah, and so it's very often unforeseeable. And you can have the best intentions on certain solutions or interventions and not have the imagination to realize, oh, it's going to lead to that.
Yeah, and you can just get unlucky. Or look, there are strategies that are genius on a Friday, and you look like a moron on a Monday, and there's no difference in how different things. How you were a minute late or a minute early, and we forget that sometimes, right? And the history is written by the winners.
And it also is written not only by the winners, but the better accuracy is happening 10 years later. I remember in the business realm here, Jack Welch. I remember the hierarchy.
Oh yeah, the airplane case that when I was in college, Jack Welch, you had to learn about Jack Welch and that has aged so poorly.
Yes, yes, it has. I actually even think one of the other big books that I don't even know if it featured Jack Welch. It might have, like Good to Great. Some of the companies that get featured in that, like, very shortly thereafter, turned out to not do so well. It's actually very difficult to predict these things. Another example, I think it's Blade Runner, that they were going to use these timeless companies for the big banners in the movies. Like, half of them were literally out of business 5 years later. It's very, very difficult to predict the future. You see it in financial markets. What is it? Over a 10-year period, an S&P 500 ETF will beat 94% of all professional money managers. Yeah. I mean, it's just, we don't know. We do not know. And I find that the humility that ought to imbue in people is more prevalent with folks who have less education. And that is such a fascinating dichotomy to some extent, right? Like, that the most learned, the most credentialed academics are the ones least capable of accepting the limitations of their own intellect. And again, Thomas Sowell is just absolutely a gold mine on the analysis of exactly why that is and how that manifests itself. The Quest for Cosmic Justice, I think, is one of the other books that he's written that's incredible on this topic and really helped me just articulate these sort of dilemmas, like, where these trade-offs are different and, like, there just aren't good solutions.
He's got one of my new favorite top 5 quotes. I'm going to butcher it here, but have we reached the ultimate state of ridiculousness that people are responsible, for what happened before they were born, but not for what they do, in their own life? I was like, wow, that's actually pretty accurate.
Not only that, really accurate. I think what's so interesting to me, and I still haven't fully unpacked this box, is to the degree we're recreating aspects of religion that religion had in a really full featured package, like shame and redemption and original sin. And once we lose some of those concepts in organized religion, we try to reinvent new versions of them. And we quite often do it relatively poorly. There's a reason why some of these religions have stuck around for 2,000 years plus, is that as a whole, the package had been debugged enough and was appealing enough that it could impart some moral truths onto people who really didn't want to hear them, right? Most people don't want to hear on limitations on their own sort of instincts. They want to do what they want to do, and they prefer to get rationalizations for why it's actually okay to do a bad thing. So to find these packages that religion, at least the best of them, have, that constrain our natural and worst instincts for greater good, for is actually quite unique. And trying to recreate that like over a 20-year span, yeah, it's going to be difficult, right? I think there's a reason why most of those enduring religions are millennia old, because most of the strains that come afterwards, most of the experiments that come after, they don't make it. And some of these new strains we've been trying to concoct lately, they're not making it, right? They're bad. Like the reinvention of original sin as some sort of racial hierarchy because someone with your skin color 200 years ago perhaps had some connection to something bad. No, that's a bad idea. That's a bad idea. Let's go back to Jesus. And I say that as someone, I'm not a religious person.
Right. I was going to say, you wouldn't strike me as that. Yeah.
No, I'm not. But I have come
But you
to
appreciate religion serve this purpose, and with it, people are finding it in politics. They're finding it in all kind of other ways that are probably even less healthy than the problems that they had with religion.
I don't even think probably.
Yeah.
I think definitely. Yeah. I think the reinventions or the reanimations of some of those core themes that religion had provided folks with are distinctly worse. And this is one of the things where I also feel like I've had to update my map. I remember watching Bill Maher's Religulous, I think it came out in 2009, where he just makes fun of religion and all the ways they're silly and stupid. And it's not that he's wrong in some minor sense, that there are a lot of contradictions, there are a lot of weird stuff. Like if you look at the major religions that are 2,000 years old, they have a bunch of abstract good ideas that are just enduring across time. And then they have some very specific prohibitions and ideas that are grounded in what life was like 2,500 years ago. And like, what do we do to prevent disease here? Oh, maybe we shouldn't eat pigs or something. And you just go like, you take that for 2,500 years and you're like, yeah, okay. In some rational sense, that doesn't make sense. Some of these other ideas actually do make sense, right? And do fill a void. And I have had to reluctantly at first and now more enthusiastically accept that worked for some definition.
Well, you're a software guy, so I think you got to appreciate that humans need an operating system, right? And without one operating, and again, we need a society without one. You will find another operating system, and it just might be more destructive than the last one.
I mean, that is the joke in a lot of, I build software tools. A lot of what I do is to build software tools for other people to build their applications. And one thing we often talk about here is the not invented here syndrome, is that when you go back and say like that tool that's been out there and used by hundreds of people for 10 years or thousands of people is bad because of this. I'm going to make my own, right? That's the not invented here syndrome. And sometimes you're correct and you'll come up with a bad idea. Most of the time, you'll just realize that you didn't understand the problem.
And that stood the test of time, that tool.
It stood the test of time. And if you look at these religions, if you look at it in a very abstract sense, in an overly learned sense, in an over intellectual sense, you can go like, I don't understand why this fence is here. Why is this prohibition here? What if we just ripped out the fence? And is that the Chesterton's fence law? Something like, don't remove a fence until you know why it's there. Sometimes it looks like a fence make no sense. Why is it there? And then you remove it and you realize all the demons that were lurking on the other side. And you go like, oh shit, guess we shouldn't have removed the fence. We forgot why we put it there, but the white walkers are still on the other side of the wall.
All right, well, David, you can cover a variety of topics, and where can people follow your writing and your work if they want to learn more?
DHH.DK is my own personal website. You can find links to my Hey World newsletter, to the books I've written, and to everything else that I have done over my career and I'm focused on right now.
All right. Well, David, thanks for joining us again. Round 2 went fast. We're going to have you back for round 3 and dig into this parenting thing, because I didn't want to get too far down that rope. I could have gone another hour, and I'm deep in my research on it, but particularly this, why do leadership experts behave like this as parents? But we're going to get into that.
Please, I would love that discussion.
All right, to our listeners, thanks for tuning into the Elevate podcast today. We'll include links to David and his work on the detailed episode page at robertglazer.com. Thank you again for your support. And until next time, keep elevating.